Yes, we're delighted to be joined this Friday night by Aidan O'Brien. Not Aidan O'Brien, the horse trainer, but Aidan O'Brien, the Deputy Principal in Good Counsel College Secondary School in New Ross, County Wexford. And Aidan, thank you very much for taking the time to have a chat with myself and Fran. And basically, people are probably wondering, what is this leading to? But there was a brilliant article that Mark Boylan wrote in the Racing Post a couple of weeks ago about your passion for racing and how many students have passed through the Good Counsel College Secondary School in New Ross that are now working all over the globe in the horse racing industry and in the breeding industry as well.
Yeah, Lucas, thanks very much for inviting me along. Yeah, Mark Boylan rang me there some weeks ago and proposed doing this article. I'm not quite sure where he got wind of the fact that there were as many past pupils of ours in racing. But maybe it was one day last summer there were four past pupils, four individuals rode winners on one Leopardstown card, which I suppose was quite unusual that four lads from the one school would all have ride winners on a single card in Leopardstown, and then someone else rode a winner later that evening. I think Sean Flanagan up in Downpatrick. But yeah, over the years, I suppose, given where we're located down in the southeast on the Kilkenny-Wexford borders, there's plenty of interest in racing and plenty of, I suppose, families involved in racing down there. So inevitably there would be a certain number of them find their way into our place. And I suppose I have a keen interest in racing myself, and over the years there's been an opportunity to sort of marry the two, I suppose. And from my point of view, I suppose I see it as an opportunity maybe to, expose young fellas who have an interest in racing or in the bloodstock industry to maybe opportunities that might exist in the industry. And so over the years we would have done things like brought groups to various racing trainers, establishments, brought them to Aintree indeed on a good number of occasions, and visited various places like that, a few stud farms, Coolmore, Kildangan and what have you. So yeah, we've had a lot of past pupils in the place who are now in racing or in the industry around the world. And you mentioned the Aidan O'Brien. Well, he actually is a past pupil of our school too. No relation whatsoever of mine. He had gone from the school just before I arrived there, but I got to know him and meet him over the years, and indeed he has very kindly accommodated groups from the school going down to visit Ballydoyle and Coolmore many times over the years, and has always been tremendously accommodating and very supportive. And of course, when you bring young fellas to a place like Ballydoyle, if they're interested in racing, well, it certainly whets their appetite, I suppose, for possibilities, and they see things done to such exceptional standards and see horses, phenomenal pedigrees and what have you,
And Aidan, it's a lot. I know a lot of the students that have passed through your college, and we'll go into detail. There's a long list of them in a few moments' time. But a lot of them come from racing backgrounds, but a lot of them don't come from racing backgrounds. And it's great that you nurture, saying it, and ignite maybe the passion for racing. Show, especially to the non-racing students, that it just shows that they can get involved in some shape or form in our industry, because at the end of the day, it is a massive industry, the horse industry in Ireland. And it's a great way of just nurturing those non-racing kids into the industry, isn't it?
Well, I agree. Like, it is a big industry, and of course it's it's a huge part of the Irish economy. And look, obviously we would have quite a strong agricultural cohort, if you like, and in tandem with that, a lot of the students would have some connection with horses or with breeding or whatever. But we would have students who have gone on, obviously, into the obvious ones who are jockeys and so on. And we've mentioned Aidan O'Brien. Enda Bulger is another past pupil, a star pupil by all accounts before my time. And but we would have lads who were in all sectors of the industry, from breeding, management, media, indeed, sales, working with sales companies, and then other areas like with some of the feed companies like Glanbia, Red Mills, and so on. We'd have past pupils who were working with those companies too. So look, for me, obviously, when you take something like a trip to entry, the immediate sort of response or reaction from some people would be, how would you get away with that sort of thing? But we wouldn't just go to entry with a group of lads with a view to, backing horses or anything like that. It wouldn't be like that at all. In fact, when we would go to entry, we'd always try and tie it in with something a little more broad than just the race meeting itself. So, for example, we would, in recent times when we'd go across, we'd go to Tom Dascombe's Manor House Stables, Michael Owen's place. And again, you're looking at a facility that's second to none. It's just top class facilities. And, young fellas been exposed to that sort of facility, to see things done the way they're done over there. Obviously, that's valuable. And it does, as you say, sort of maybe make them aware that there's more possibilities within the industry than just becoming a jockey, which obviously only a very limited number can possibly do.
And regards the trip to entry, how many do you limit it to? Is there a massive uptake in it every year?
Well, I would limit it to about 18 or 20 would be the maximum, because I wouldn't fancy trying to manage any more than that realistically. I would look at lads that go are typically fellas that would have some interest in racing, but you'd have lads going that would have no background in racing at all and would still come along and they might be interested in racing, and some of them would in fact end up going on into developing that further, if you like, in terms of where they might go with their careers. But yeah, the first time we went was back in 1991. I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying that. Seagram was the winner of the national that year, and some of the fellows that were on that trip, sure, look at there would be friends of mine, I suppose, at this stage, and they often reminisce about it and talk about it and what have you. And, lads like Neil Walsh there, who works for Goffs. Neil would have been on one of those very early trips, and I remember one of the very early ones, Richie Galway, who's now the manager of Punchestown Racecourse. Richie was on a trip, and in fact, I remember walking the course with that particular cohort when we were, it must have been 92 or sometime around then, and Richie was on the group. And as we were walking the course, coming in the opposite direction, also walking the course was Tommy Stack and a young fella who I presume was probably his son Plozzy, and with them was Barney Curley. So we stopped and we said hello, and I remember some of the boys getting in for a photograph with Barney. He was very obliging, and little things like that obviously mean a lot to young fellas. Even in more recent times, it's more difficult to get out on the track and entry. And back in those days, you could walk the whole track, and I think nearly anyone from the public could. But like last year, we went Tiger Road won his second national. Look, we would, I suppose, use the connections we now have with somebody like Tom O'Brien, and Tom very kindly would arrange for our lads to get out on the track. And I have a lovely photograph of the whole group sitting on the takeoff board of the chair. And, I'm sure there were people the other side of the fence looking in and saying, who the hell are these fellas? How are they out there on the course, able to get such access? So that kind of experience, obviously, it really, as you said, fires the imaginations of the young fellas. And, I think it's a very positive thing.
And at that stage of your life as well, you're very impressionable as well, aren't you? And you always remember like having a picture there or meeting Barney Curley, for argument's sake, and that can ignite. You can come away as a kid saying, "This is the industry that I want to get into."
Well, possibly, obviously, that's the kind of thing that I know myself. The horses and the people from racing who I suppose are, in my own imagination, the most magical are the ones that I encountered as a young fella. I mean, I could recall details probably of horses from my very young years almost better than I could the ones from more recent years. Horses like Escargot, Captain Christie. I was as a young fella a huge Bobby Coonan fan, and it's just a complete oddity. But so horses like Captain Christie, and obviously the whole Red Rum years and all of that. Those years are very formative years, of course, and the impression that those experiences leave upon you, they do resonate. And I suppose, look, it's often said that you may not remember an awful lot of what you were taught in school, but you will probably remember a lot of how you were taught. And I suppose we always talk about the holistic experience and sort of the whole person and all the various dimensions to education. It's not simply about what goes on within the four walls of the classroom, and bringing groups of young people away and exposing them to, practices of excellence in places that we have gone to, and even to experiences like a race meeting in Aintree. I mean, there's lots of learning attached to all of that, I can tell you too.
And Aidan, just obviously you've seen what a good industry you think racing is and the benefits of it, and a good career path or life path for people. But what can racing learn from your experiences of, you're one school out of I don't know how many get engaged with racing. Do you think racing could be more proactive in going out there and trying to get younger people involved, or what would your advice be if you flipped it over that you're in charge of racing, say?
Well, I know racing, works hard at trying to promote itself and so on, and I certainly wouldn't be in any way critical of what the racing industry does. But I suppose very often when you find any school that maybe has a particular area that is successful in, whether it's debating or whether it's rugby or whether it's music or some other sports, you usually find in that school that there's somebody, a teacher, who has a particular passion for that and maybe drives that forward. And I think maybe rather than always maybe thinking about targeting the youngsters themselves, it mightn't be a bad idea to actually try and identify people in schools who might have a particular interest in, let's say, the industry, racing industry, and maybe support them in maybe running initiatives, maybe make them aware of the possibilities of what they might do in terms of bringing the industry to the students in the school. I mean, obviously, I do know that some of the studs, for example, we visited Kildangan, and Joe Osborne was extremely accommodating and so good to us there. And I suppose the connection there for us was we had a few boys who were on the Flying Start program, and I know that they do liaise with some of the local schools up there in terms of maybe supporting them with programs that they run and so on. And I think like any school in the country isn't terribly far away from whether it's a racetrack or whether it's a stud farm or whether it's a training establishment. And there has to be possibilities for connections being made between those organizations and the schools. And, so I would say that, it probably needs to be done on a sort of a regional basis or on a localized basis, and maybe to encourage, whether it's racetracks or, other areas of the racing industry to reach out to schools and maybe, get in there, organize maybe trips out to their facilities, show them what's available. Like, I think most youngsters, if they think of racing, they probably just think of immediately as a jockey, and they're not thinking maybe of all the other career paths that would exist within the industry, and try and, I suppose, raise awareness around those and have young people realize that, there are job opportunities in this industry that we could explore. I often think that there are probably a lot of people working in jobs in factories that are, very often perhaps they're not finding huge job satisfaction, and perhaps they mightn't be on any greater wage working in the racing industry, but there's almost certainly the possibilities for much greater job satisfaction in terms of variety, in terms of an outdoor lifestyle, in terms of just, working with animals. And I would say a lot of people have never even considered that that might be a possibility for them, because it was never brought to their attention, or it never came across their radar. You know what I mean?
I do, and no, it makes perfect sense. And if you look at Kevin, he couldn't ride and he had to go a different route. So, there is plenty of options.
Yeah. Well, he's not doing too bad. He's not doing too bad. Well, look at, you talk about, we obviously, that we have a certain amount of fellas who are jockeys, and pretty well-known ones. Sean Flanagan and Johnny Moore. I mentioned Tom O'Brien in England, and Shane Foley, obviously, on the flat, with a couple of apprentices, Donogh O'Connor, Mikey Sheehy, Danny Sheehy, and there are others. I could list off several others. But, we also have lads then who, we mentioned Richie Galway in administration. We have Neil Walsh, that I mentioned in the sales. But we have lads in media, like yourselves, the two Murphys, Donal and Eamon Murphy, are both past pupils of our place. We have lads involved in stud firms. I mentioned a couple of fellows who were on the Flying Start programs. Sam Hart is working out in Kentucky. Stephen O'Connor out in Australia, both doing extremely well. We have guys who go on into show jumping. We'd have a few fairly well-established lads in that industry. Jack Ryan, Damien Doyle, a guy called David Quigley over in England. There's so many other areas then as well. You take it. I mentioned to Mark Boylan, I think it was, like when Joseph O'Brien won 2 Melbourne Cups, on both occasions, the lad who was looking after the horses over there and led them up was MJ Dorn. And you probably know MJ. MJ is a past pupil of ours. He was centre forward on an under-14 football team I had to win a Leinster title. So he was a great footballer as well, I can tell you. But the year before last, a horse called Vaughan de Clare won the Melbourne Cup, and he's trained in Australia by Danny O'Brien. And the guy that looked after that horse and led him up was a young lad called Kieran Roach. And Kieran was in school with us, and I remember very well bringing him on a school trip to Jessica Harrington's and to Punchestown races afterwards. And on that same trip that I brought him to Jessica's, Dean Sinnott, who now works for Dermot Weld. And Dean is such a lovely fella. He always was. And Dean looked after Harzand, who won the Derby, obviously, for the late Pat Smullen. And I remember actually the day Harzand won the Irish Derby. I actually was in the Curragh that day, and I was standing on my own right over beside the gate where the horses go out onto the track. And Dermot Weld came along, and he was just on his own, and I wouldn't know Dermot Weld at all, and never met him. But I said to myself, here, I'll chance it. And I just said, hello, Mr. Weld. I said, you have a past pupil of mine working for you, a young man called Dean Sinnott. And for the next 10 minutes, Dermot Weld spoke to me, and he couldn't speak more highly enough about Dean Sinnott. And he eulogised about him, and he said he's actually down at the starting stalls today with Harzand just to make sure everything is okay and what have you. So it was lovely to hear that. And, to hear him speak so highly of someone that I knew as a kid in school, and, to see him getting on so well, those are, there's great satisfaction from my point of view when you see something like that.
And that's great. That's great to hear. You answered my next question, Aidan. I was going to say to you, you must get great satisfaction, great sense of pride and fulfillment out of hearing stories like that. And obviously, you've answered that question. But so many of your former past students are spread far and wide throughout the world in all different sectors of the industry. That's wonderful.
Well, of course it is, and and it is. Look, I obviously, for me, it's an indulgence, really. I mean, I can tell you, I don't take any credit whatsoever for any of them getting on as well as they've done, but it is great to see them getting on so well. And I mean, when I see Shane Foley ride a couple of classic winners, sure, listen, it's it's just phenomenal. It's fantastic, because I remember Shane so well in school. I actually taught him English for his junior cert, and he could have been a journalist. He was very competent in his English studies, I can tell you. But to see him getting on so well, and I know that Shane would have said, in the past, that he probably might never have gone into racing if he had gone to a different school, because he happened to be a contemporary of Matthew O'Connor's and Sean Flanagan, and they were all around the same time, and they all ended up heading off to race more or less at the same time. And over the years, look, obviously we'd have had a lot of lads go to race, and I can't speak highly enough of them up there. I would know Keith Rowe and the people who race, and they do a great job. And to see, as you say, there's lads all around the world working in studs, working in various aspects of the business, and it's very satisfying to see them getting on well, and long may it continue.
And Kevin Doyle, of course, former Irish international soccer player, played at Reading and Wolves and a few other clubs as well, finished his career in America. He always had a love. Obviously, his dad, Paddy Doyle, of course, was always into breeding and that. And now he's become big time involved in the higher end of jumping mares since he's retired.
Yeah. Look, I would know Kevin well. He comes from the same parish here that I'm living in myself, and Kevin, obviously his father did breed Holywell and a few other good ones, and Kevin has got very much into the breeding side of things, and picked up Levago O'Roy there recently, and Augusta Kate previously, and he has obviously some other good mares as well, and has the half brother Valtior, who I'm sure he'll be going back to the sales bit next year. So yeah, Kevin is really getting, he has been bitten by the bug, and I'm sure that it'll be what he'll do for the remainder of his days. So yeah, Kevin, look, there are other fellas who operate, like Michael Shefflin, Anishun stud. He'd be very involved with the buying and selling of horses with the Holdens there, and that sale of John Bond recently for 570,000 guineas. Michael was a past pupil. There are others like Declan Phelan runs a stud there in Tuller House stud. Because it sort of is. It's almost hard to credit at times, just the volume of fellas who have been in the school who are now working in the industry, and I suppose it really highlights just the reach of the industry and the scope of it, and the possibilities that are there, for people to find employment at all sorts of levels, whether it is, at the high end of breeding, or whether it's, working in yards, head lads and whatever, so there's plenty of opportunities there,
And Aidan, where did your interest from racing evolve from? You're a Westmead man. How did a Westmead man end up down in Wexford?
Well, I ended up in Wexford simply because there was a job advertised in the school back in the mid-80s, 86, and I think my mother sent off an application form, and I ended up getting the job in Wexford. And so, yeah, I come from Westmead, a small village, Balnagore, in the parish of Castletown Gagan. So I don't know, look, I'm born on a small farm. There would always have been a couple of horses there for working the farm, working the land. My father worked horses all his life, and there would have been an old draft mare kept on the land as well, and she'd have been put in foal with Ted Carey up the road had a stud farm. Used to stand a few stallions. I think I remember what was it, Vividari and Blue something or other. He had so it would have been a horses around there. But your Kilbeggan Racecourse was about 3 miles away. Middleton Park, the home, the ancestral home of the Boyd Rochfords, and it was subsequently owned by Barney Curley, who famously raffled it. And I don't know if you recall that particular episode, but Barney, I suppose, putting the house and land on the market at the time, mightn't have realised its true value, but he elected to raffle it, and he, to make it legal, obviously had to align it with some charities. So I think St. Vincent de Paul were one of the beneficiaries, and our local GA club in Ballinagore were the other beneficiaries. But obviously there were some questions raised as to the legality of the whole matter, all of which were sorted ultimately. But some of the officers of the local GA club anyway ended up in court as witnesses for the defence when Barney was being questioned over the legality of it. But sure, it was a great piece of I suppose creativity on Barney's part, and given what we know about Yellow Sam and Bellewstown, he wasn't averse to finding creative ways of making a few pounds. Talking about my own background, there was also a man who was born just up the road from us who ended up on the Curragh. He was a jockey when I was a young fella, and his family all live in Ballinagore still. Frank Ennis was his name, and I'm sure you probably know Frank. And over the years, he trained in the Curragh. So the fact that he was in my consciousness, and Kilbeggan Racecourse and Middleton Park, all of that sort of seeps in, and I suppose you become interested in racing as a result of that. And I mentioned already that I used to follow, when I was a kid, the way other kids might follow a rock star or a soccer star or something like that. I used to follow a jockey called Bobby Coonan, and he would have been riding at the same time as your father, Fran. And in fact, he shared the championship with him one year. I think himself, your dad, and Tommy Carberry all shared it one year. But Bobby was a multiple champion himself. But I could have told you every horse that Bobby was riding, every detail of his career at that stage. So I just had a fascination with racing, I suppose, and following him the way I did just led you deeper and deeper into it. And then I had an uncle, and I have to give him a mention. My uncle Tony was a priest, actually, and he was out in Seoul in Korea as a Columban father. He's still alive and very well in Dalton Park now, but he would come home every 4 or 5 years from being out foreign, and he loved racing. And he would often go to Phoenix Park or Naas or wherever, but he brought me to the Curragh in 1975 for the Irish Derby, and I was only 10 or 11, and I remember that very, very vividly. Grundy won the Derby that day, and sure, look at seeing all these famous jockeys. Pat Edery obviously rode Grundy. Lester Pickett was riding one for Vincent that day. It was second in a horse called King Pellinore. I remember Joe Mercer. So all of these guys were there, and that obviously just, again, we talked about it earlier, so that obviously fired my imagination and only deepened my interest in racing.
And Aidan, I know it's different times, but if you had the exposure when you went to secondary school as you are given the students in your school, do you think you might have ended up working in the racing industry in some shape or form?
That's an interesting question. So look at, I suppose if I was honestly, if I had my time back again, I probably would love to have maybe done something in the racing industry, because it's something I'm hugely interested in. But I did something that I was very interested in anyway. I went on to be a PE teacher, and so I spent most of my life working in that area. And obviously I'm still in school now in a more managerial position. But it's very possible for sure. I can't say other than I certainly wouldn't have been going the jockey route given my size and what have you. And I certainly wouldn't have been allowed, given my mother's predilection for getting a good education and trying to find a good, steady job. But look, it's possible. And I suppose nowadays, I would say, I think you'd know better than I, but I think it's fair to say that conditions within the industry for employees across the board would be far, far better now than they would have been, let's say, 30, 40 years ago. And especially, for guys working in yards, in terms of their rights and, the safeguards that are in place and, the terms and conditions of their employment, obviously. So, while encouraging people into the industry now, you'd be much more comfortable doing so, knowing that, there are opportunities there and that, people are much better cared for and looked after, and the supports that are there, whether it's to get additional education through courses that the likes of Race run, or whether it's supports that are provided, in all sorts of areas for employees in the industry. You'd be a lot more comfortable encouraging and advocating for people to pursue.
Fran, do you want to continue?
No, I just had to see. Aidan, just one thing you were told there tonight, obviously, Shane Foley, we know well, he said he went to your school because of sports there, and obviously that's a lead on to what you've done and racing in tow with that. But we're also told tonight that a singer called Maverick Sabre went to Wexford, who I thought was an Englishman, but is that true or not?
Oh, that's absolutely true, yeah. Maverick Sabre, Michael Stafford, as he was then, past pupil of our school, and he has been back. In fact, he has dropped back, and I've met him a few times over the years since. So, yeah, Maverick is a past pupil. Listen, we're not just exclusively, we haven't just produced jockeys now and people. We have, well, you mentioned Kevin, in a sporting context, we have Tyke Furlong playing rugby for Ireland. We've had several hurling all-stars. We've had the lads, obviously, in the racing industry. You mentioned Maverick Sabre, but and look, it is important to highlight that, look, at guys in the school go on into all sorts of career paths, and it's fantastic when you see them getting on well. Only there last year I was watching a program on BBC, The One Show, and I saw one of our past pupils who was a professor of forensic science in King's College in London. He's only a young fella, and he had developed a technique for lifting fingerprints from the ivory of elephants. And this was now being used across the continent of Africa to catch poachers and so on. So listen, when you work in a school, it's fantastic. The satisfaction of seeing fellows go on into all sorts of areas, and the things they do, it's staggering, and they never cease to amaze. So yeah, you mentioned Maverick Sabre. Maverick is a past pupil for sure, and I'm not sure he sang in a school musical, so we did provide him with that launch pad for his future career.
Oh, sorry.
Go on, no, walk away.
I was going to just say it's very, very interesting, but before Kevin gets back to you, obviously Cheltenham is 4 weeks away, a little over 4 weeks away. Have you any nap for the few days? I'm sure you've got something in mind over the 4 days.
Well, I'm not sure if tipping is my strongest suit, but I think Zanahiyr is absolutely nailed on for the Triumph Hurdle. I would be inclined to stick with Epatante in the Champion Hurdle. I'd forgive her last run, and I think, it's funny. I backed Epatante once in her career, and that was in the novice mayor's hurdle 2 years ago when she absolutely bombed out. and she comes along and wins the champion hurdle the following year. So I have the capacity for putting the mockers on them. But look at beyond that, I haven't any major fancies, but those two I think are the bankers. I'm involved through the school. Well, I have a syndicate. We call ourselves Good Counsellors Syndicate, and we were lucky enough last year to have Cerberus run for us. Joseph O'Brien, you might remember, trained it at the time, and he still trains it, of course. JP now owns it, but we had at least, and it won a Grade 3 in Fairy House for us. So we were very lucky that we got to win a maiden hurdle and then win a Grade 3 on Bar One Racing Day. So that was phenomenal. And we're involved with a mayor now, again through a connection in the school. Helen Power Wall, who would be Robbie Power's aunt. Her son Eddie came to school with us, and Helen rather owns a mare called Sue Lawling, and she had it with Gavin Cromwell and was keen to get somebody to take it on to race it. So we have her leased now, and she races in our colours. But she finished third in a maiden hurdle in Cork, behind Appreciated and Master McShee. So she was taking on stiff company that day. Now she was beaten 30 lengths into third place, but yeah, the form hasn't worked out too bad. So Appreciated obviously is one that is the current favourite for the Supreme. Although I wouldn't be rushing to back him now. To be honest with you, I think he might need a bit further out.
And Aidan, your knowledge of form and just pedigrees and all is I'll tell you what, you're making myself and Fran look fairly poor here, isn't he, Fran? It's your knowledge you're obviously a student of not just the form books, but of catalogues and pedigrees as well. And it's phenomenal just listening to you here, the form you're reeling off and what horses are buying related to and out of.
Well, I wouldn't consider I have a huge knowledge in that regard now, but I would follow racing obviously quite closely, and I would have a fairly good handle on form, and I would obviously, I suppose, follow it closely enough that I would be able to at least have a conversation about it anyway. But I wouldn't like to suggest that I would be the person to come to now if you want a sure thing for any particular race. No, I would leave that to others. But a story that might be of interest to you, and it highlights, I suppose, the character of Aidan O'Brien, the trainer, who, as I mentioned to you, is a past pupil of ours. I remember bringing a group down to Aidan's one year, and he met us and he was showing us around and so on. And there was a horse. He said, "Lads, there's a horse over here. He might be of interest for the Derby, and if you want to have a pound each way or something like that." And as it turned out, and he said, this horse's name is Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare turned out to be very ordinary. And in fact, the night before the Derby, if I'm not mistaken, he ran in a maiden in Cork, and obviously never made that at all. But the interesting part of the story was we were back the following year with a group, and we were being shown around, and Aidan came along and joined us, and he walked down and shook hands and was walking back up towards the main yard with us. And I always remember it as a sort of a phenomenal testament to his character, really. As we were walking along, he said, "Janie, Aidan," he said, "I gave you lads a horse here last year." And he said, "Every day it ran, I thought of you." And that was Shakespeare. But the next sentence was, he said, but I have the one this year. And we walked over, and he brought us to a box, and there was a horse looking out over the door, and he said, "Lads, this is a horse that has ran once there for us last year at the back end as a 2-year-old and won very well, and we think an awful lot of him." And he went on to speak about the horse, and he wasn't saying if, he was saying when. When he wins the Derby, the plan will be to go back to the Irish Derby, and then after that he'll go for the King George. And it was when he won that, etc. And the horse was Galileo. And he wasn't far wrong. he knew he had a good one at that stage. And this was before the horse would have ran in the Ballysacks or in the Burnstown. It was at that stage of the year, back in maybe April of that particular year. So I think, it was always something that I remember because, as I said, the fact that he would have remembered mentioning Shakespeare to us, I was staggered by it. He wouldn't. It's not like he wouldn't have enough to be thinking about.
Unbelievable. Hey, I hope he loaded up on him, Aidan.
Can't comment on that.
Aidan, more importantly, have you spoken to Aidan? Have you got this year's one? I know, obviously, with current restrictions, you can't go down there, but we're curious. Have you got the one for this year's derby of Aidan, aren't we, Fran?
Definitely.
No, I haven't. I haven't been speaking to him recently, and I wouldn't be asking him that question. But I hopefully he has. I suspect that in recent years, Aidan probably hasn't known himself. When the likes of Wings of Eagles and Serpentine have gone and won, I'm sure he wasn't thinking that they were his number one bullets in those particular derbies. But that high definition looks a fairly useful 2-year-old, and I'm sure he'll have a say in how things work out this year, won't he?
Yes, indeed. He was very, very good, and he won when he won the Barristers, wasn't he? He beat Kevin Prendergast last round, didn't he?
He did, yeah. He looks a proper one. Yeah, it wouldn't definitely not put you off him. He's could be the real deal by a long way. Yeah.
Have you any preference, Aidan, flat or jumping?
Well, I would say, coming from a background in rural Ireland and being raised with Kilbeggan races on the doorstep, National Hunt would be my preference. But I'm very keen on the flat too. I love it. I love them both. My father never, I'd say, went to a race meeting anywhere except Kilbeggan, but he never ever missed Kilbeggan. I think, Lord have mercy on him, he died 4 years ago, but I think for something like 70 years he never missed a meeting in Kilbeggan. He would just be, that was his day out, going to the Kilbeggan races. He didn't go anywhere else. He farmed away, but on the day of the Kilbeggan races, he knocked off early, and he would be nearly the first man in the track. And he'd be meeting and all the lads that were coming in and what have you. Yeah. So, but those days were fantastic. I remember as a kid going to Kilbeggan races, and you'd be in the infield that time, and there was swing boats, and there was Trick of the Loops, and Christy Hanley used to have a roulette table, Lord have mercy on him, and it was just fantastic atmosphere. And I suppose, look, at one thing race courses struggle to provide now is that same level of atmosphere that would have prevailed in those days, because sure, even you go into the betting ring now, it's nothing like it used to be when Sean Graham was standing on the corner and shouting to let him in and let him out and all the rest of it. But my preference, I suppose, would be for National Hunt. Yeah.
And Aidan, just obviously moving away from racing for a moment. Obviously, the current restrictions that we're in, and obviously, it's obviously all your team of teachers are basically all Zoom calls. Do you find that very difficult? And also, do you miss the interaction with your students? Do you miss that as teachers yourselves?
Yeah, unquestionably. Look at from our experience of the online teaching and learning over the last few months. Well, since we've returned after Christmas, it has been very positive in the sense that the level of engagement from youngsters has been great. The feedback from parents is very positive. Teachers have been very positive in terms of what they're finding, but it doesn't replace the human contact, the face-to-face. And there's no doubt in my mind that it's a poor substitute for in school experience. The academic side of things, you can accommodate pretty well, but the loss of the social dimension for youngsters is enormous, in my opinion. And I think it's really important that as far as possible, schools do get back as soon as possible. I even noticed that from September to Christmas, when we were back in school, I don't think I ever saw the kids in such good form. You know, I think they appreciated being back in school because they hadn't had any school from March, you remember, for the rest of the year until June. So, look, kids need to meet up, they need to interact, they need to do all of those things that youngsters do, form relationships, fall out of relationships, you know, have arguments, discussions, chat. Like I would say, youngsters, by and large, love going to school nowadays. It's not that they love coming in for their maths class, their English class, their history class. Well, you'd like to think that they enjoy some of that too, but they obviously, it's the social dimension of meeting their friends, the other experiences they have in school. Obviously, sport for many of them is very important, and school can provide, you know, quite a bit of that. Our own school would have a strong sporting tradition, and we would, you know, compete in a lot of sports, college sports and so on. But that side of school life is badly missed, and you know, I think all teachers would acknowledge that. And I think, look, at sometimes teachers get maybe a bit of some negative press that they don't want to be back at school and so on. Certain teachers, and there are teachers, people who have genuine concerns and genuine fears, and you have to accept and recognize that. But I think every teacher will want to be back in school, provided, you know, that it's safe to do so. And hopefully that's going to happen pretty soon. They're talking about maybe getting phased returns from the beginning of March. Well, it can't happen soon enough from my point of view, in terms of, you know, the importance of being in school for the youngsters, you know.
Yeah, it's very, very important. And Aidan, one thing I suppose Kevin and myself would like to say is that hopefully later this year or into next year that we are all back racing some bit of normality. You'll have to bring the group over to say hello on the channel, and if you want to do behind the scenes or anything on Racing TV, we'd love to get involved.
Yes, look, we'd be delighted to do anything like that. To look at anything that I suppose, you know, promotes something positive from the school's point of view, from the young fella's point of view. You know, we mentioned, you know, visiting Aidan's place in Ballydoyle and indeed Coolmore, and in fact we met Galileo a second time when we visited Coolmore, now in his capacity as a leading stallion. But I must mention other trainers who have been unbelievably kind to us when we have visited them. You know, Jessica Harrington. We've been to Jim Bulger, who pulled out all the stops. He couldn't have been, he could not have done more for us when we visited him. We visited Michael Halfords. I mentioned Kildangan, who were exceptional again. And even in Kildangan, you know, it wasn't just seeing the stallions and the horses, but we also got to see, you know, some of the farming practices that they have there, the way they recycle their waste products, their manure, and so on. Fantastic experience for the boys. I mentioned Michael Halford, and we were with Willie Mullins last year, 2019, after he won the Gold Cup with Album Photo for the first time. And again, the experience there that morning was just incredible. I mean, the time all of those trainers that I've mentioned gave to us, you know, they could very easily be forgiven for just assigning somebody, will you look after those fellas and just keep them out of my way. But they were so accommodating, so good to us, and so, willing to chat to the boys, pull out horses for them, stand in for photographs, you know, talk to them about their experience. And even like going back to Willie Mullins, I mean, for me, there was an education even around the gallops, and, you know, he had got something in to recycle some of the wood chip and salvage the old wood chip, and, you know, and the depth that the gallop is at. And there's lots of learning, to a trip like that, beyond just seeing superstar racehorses in action. So, you know, it's an opportunity for me to sort of express my gratitude to those people who were so good to us and so accommodating. whenever we did visit their facilities, And obviously, Richie Galway, obviously, as a past pupil, always looks after us. We try and tie in maybe a visit to one of those yards that I've mentioned, and then maybe an evening in Punchestown at the races. And, some of the past pupils like Sean Flanagan or Johnny Moore or whatever will come out and maybe meet the boys and take them out onto the track. And, so there's tremendous goodwill there, I suppose, that we've been lucky enough to tap into. And we're very grateful for that,
Well, Aidan, I think Fran has just touched on it there, basically. We'd just like to commend you and thank you for introducing racing and the big industry that the horse industry is in Ireland to so many of your students, and nurturing their interest in it. And the roll of honour that's gone through your school is unbelievable, and hopefully for many, many years to come, it's going to continue that way. And fair play to you. You're doing a lot for the racing industry, and long may it continue.
Well, look, I wouldn't like to take any credit, really. I mean, I feel I'm the one that really has been the main beneficiary, because I get to, by association, enjoy the success of those fellas who have gone through. And look, I would count some of the lads that I have known as students in the school. I would see them as friends of mine now. I don't even think of them as having been students. Like lads like Tom Doyle, who was a very successful national hunt jockey. Tom would be a good friend of mine. I was lucky enough to be over at Tom O'Brien's wedding there last year, and be friendly with him and his family, and many others besides. I mean, obviously we've mentioned a number of names here, and you leave out as many as you include. We would have had, I think I mentioned to you previously, Michael Doyle, who was a flat jockey, a flat apprentice with Ian Balding once upon a time. Fran, you may remember it. Little Michael. Yeah. Michael is a past pupil of ours, and he was, a great character. And actually, when Michael was in school, he rode in the school's show jumping team, and we won the All-Irelands and got invited to Hickstead as a consequence. And Michael won the international rider in the school's event in Hickstead that time. So I still meet Michael regularly. He's back in the Ross. So there's those fellas. I mean, I don't know, Robert Tector is a young fella now who's starting out. Give him a mention, a shout out. He's set up his own pre-training yard there, and I think he's maybe doing a bit of work with some of Colin Bowles' horses out near Rathnewer in Enniscorthy. And there's lads all over the place, guys breeding horses, Porrick O'Gorman and Carrowry Stud, and we mentioned others. So listen, as I said to you, I just happen to be in a school where there's lots of guys coming in with interest in racing, background in racing. Look, if I can do something to foster that, I suppose, and maybe raise their sights a little, so that they don't just think in one dimension, that they see that, look, if I can't be a jockey, well, there are other areas of the industry that I can explore. I think that's probably something that's maybe, possible to do in a school. And, so as I say, I take great pleasure in seeing them getting on well. And obviously every time any of them does something, wins or has success, well, I'm delighted for them.
Long may it continue. And Aidan, it's been a pleasure. I think Fran is the same. It was great to catch up and have a chat with you. And long may it continue. Many thanks for joining us this Friday night.
Indeed, you're very welcome, and thank you for asking me to speak to you. Look, I'm sure you could find many more worthy people for conversation, but I appreciate it, and thank you very much.